Okay, have you ever really, truly stopped to think about time? I don't mean in some big philosophical way. I mean the actual ticking numbers on your phone. We just completely take for granted that when it's 5 p.m. where you are, it's some other specific time somewhere else. But that whole system, it's not natural. It had to be invented. And trust me, the story of how we got it is way more chaotic and interesting than you'd ever imagine.
So let's just start with a super basic question. Why is there even such a thing as 5 p.m.? I mean, why isn't time just, whatever the sun is doing outside? Well, for almost all of human history, that's exactly what it was. This idea of a synchronized global now is actually a brand new and totally revolutionary invention. Before we had time zones, every single town and village lived on its own private time. You'd use a sundial, or you'd just look up. When the sun hit its absolute highest point in the sky for the day, boom, that was noon. It was simple, it was natural, and it worked just fine. For a little while, anyway.
So let's just take a quick step back into that world. A world where every single city was, and I mean this literally, its own little island of time.
The fancy term for this is apparent solar time. And because the Earth is a sphere that's always spinning, the sun is always hitting noon somewhere on the planet. This meant time wasn't just different between, say, New York and London. Oh no, it was different between New York and Philadelphia.
And here's where it gets kind of wild. The math was actually pretty simple. For every single degree of longitude you moved to the west, noon showed up 4 minutes later. So if your clock struck 12 p.m. in one town, it might be 11:56 a.m. in the town just a few miles west. Now, can you imagine trying to coordinate anything? This wasn't a huge deal when the fastest you could travel was on a horse, but that was all about to change in a very, very big way.
And that change brings us to the Great Collision. And I'm not just talking about trains here, but a collision of a new, high-speed world with an ancient, slower way of keeping track of the day. So you had this perfect storm of technology that created an absolute nightmare. First, suddenly you have really accurate mechanical clocks, making every city's unique local time super precise. Then the railroads explode, connecting all these different time islands at incredible speeds. And to top it all off, the telegraph meant you could instantly know what time it was in a city hundreds of miles away. The result? Total, unadulterated chaos.
And this quote just perfectly captures the madness. I want you to picture this. You're standing in a train station, and you look up at the wall and see 3, 4, maybe even 5 clocks, and every single one is showing a different time for the different train lines coming through. Trying to make a connection wasn't just tricky, it was practically impossible. It was confusing, it was inefficient, and it was actually really dangerous.
So who finally stepped in to solve this mess? Was it the government? Scientists? Nope, it was big business. The American railroad companies, driven purely by the need to create reliable schedules and, not have their trains crash into each other, became the unlikely inventors of modern time. They knew they couldn't run a national network on 1,000 different local times. They had to invent a whole new system from scratch.
And all that pressure, all that chaos, it brings us to the climax of our story, the day the clocks and the entire world were changed forever.
You're going to want to remember this date, November 18, 1883. It was nicknamed the Day of Two Noons. On this one single Sunday, the railroads across all of North America basically said, enough is enough, and decided to stop the chaos and impose order. It was a truly stunning, massive feat of coordination.
So here's how they pulled it off. They carved up the continent into 4 nice, neat zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Then, a master telegraph signal was sent out from an observatory. As that signal clicked over to high noon in the Eastern time zone, all the cities in that zone reset their clocks. An hour later, wham, the Central zone did the same, and so on, all the way across the country. In a single day, hundreds of local times were just gone, wiped off the map, replaced by this clean, logical system.
But that system wasn't exactly set in stone. Just look at this early map from 1913. The edges of these so-called time belts are all jagged and weird. They run right through the middle of cities. They look totally different from the much straighter lines we're used to seeing today. It just goes to show you, even after the big day, the whole thing was still a work in progress, constantly being tweaked for convenience and business.
And that brings us right into the modern world, where this logical, scientific system of time zones crashes head-on with the messy reality of politics, history, and just plain old geography. Okay, this is one of my favorite comparisons ever. On the left, you've got how time zones should look, in theory, these perfect straight lines dividing the globe every 15 degrees. And on the right, well, that's the map we actually use.
It's a chaotic, zigzagging mess of political compromises and historical accidents. So what gives? Why the huge difference?
Well, let's look at the most extreme example out there, China. Geographically, this absolutely massive country should naturally span 5 different time zones. But for the sake of political unity, the entire nation runs on one single time. This means that if you're in the far west of China, the sun can be at its highest point, solar noon, as late as 3 p.m. on the clock. Insane, right?
And oh, it gets so much weirder. Most time zones are offset by a nice, clean hour, but not all of them. You've got Newfoundland in Canada, which is off by 3.5 hours. India is 5.5 hours ahead of the standard, and then there's Nepal, which decided to split the difference even more and land on a 45-minute offset. These aren't typos. They're basically historical footnotes and political deals written right onto the face of the clock.
And here's another fantastic example of politics just completely warping time. Take a look at Spain. It sits directly south of the UK, right in line with Greenwich Mean Time. So why is it an hour ahead? Well, during World War II, the Spanish dictator Franco shifted the country's clocks to be aligned with Nazi Germany. And after the war, they just never bothered to change it back. So yeah, this system is kind of weird, kind of messy, but it's a mess that we all absolutely depend on every single second of the day. So let's talk about why this 19th century solution, designed for steam trains, is now the invisible backbone of our entire digital world.
The modern gold standard is called Coordinated Universal Time, or UTC. The easiest way to think about it is as the master clock for the entire planet. Every computer, every server farm, every satellite in orbit speaks UTC. It's the universal translator for time, making sure that when you send an email from Tokyo to Brazil, every system involved agrees on the exact microsecond it happened.
And here's the bottom line. Without this standardized system, our modern world just grinds to a halt. The internet simply wouldn't work. Can you imagine the disaster of server logs and email timestamps? The global stock markets couldn't function. Your GPS would have no idea where you are. Even the International Space Station runs on UTC, just to keep its astronauts and ground crews all over the world perfectly in sync. This system, built for steam engines, is now powering our entire digital civilization.
It really is an incredible legacy when you think about it. A solution that was designed for iron rails and telegraph wires turned out to be robust enough to run a global digital society. But it does make you wonder, right? As we start to venture further out into space, to places like Mars where a day is a totally different length, what new system of time are we going to have to invent next?